So, good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be back learning with you this evening with our sixth of 7 parts of Between Heaven and Earth, case studies of the tension between Halakha and morality with Rabbi Nati Helfgot. As you come into the Zoom room, I'm going to invite you to become a panelist. That just means that you can turn on your camera if you wish, so we can see your lovely smiling faces. And it means when Rabbi Nati invites questions or comments that you can unmute and ask yourself. Although, of course, you're always welcome to share in the chat box of the Zoom or in the comments if you're joining us on Facebook Live. We just ask that you keep yourself on mute so that it minimizes background noise and we can all hear each other. I will be sharing the source sheet on the screen, but I'm also going to put them in the chat so you can have the source sheet if you want to follow along yourself. And with that, over to Rabbi Nati.
Thank you. Okay, good evening to everybody. Hope everyone had a good week. The week that we had off, I was in Israel until last night, so I got back this morning. It's wonderful to be back with you. This is, as was said, this is the 6th of the 7th part. Next week is our last class in this series. Going to tie up some loose ends, speak about maybe a smaller topic or two, and then maybe just make some couple of broad comments that emerge from some of the stuff that we looked at during the course of the mini series. Tonight, we're going to examine the topic of the tension in halakha and ethics in the question of Amalek, the question of the relationship of the halakha in our relationship to Amalek, and what the Torah commands of us of Amalek, and certainly our sense today of morality, especially the word genocide is thrown around very much too easily today, but certainly that is something that emerges as a major question, certainly in our Western notion. Certainly after World War II, genocide is really a terrible thing, and something that we certainly don't want to see happening in the world. Okay, so let's put up the source sheet up on the screen, and we'll start at the beginning with just some of the basic sources, and we'll lay out what the biblical material says, what it doesn't say explicitly, and how it was interpreted throughout history. And again, as I said, I'm focusing on those sources that try to walk the line between an ethical, moral sense of how they understood halakha and their fidelity to the written text. So, of course, we have the famous story, source number 1, of the Bible describing there was this great battle after the Israelites left Egypt, and there's this great battle that Amalek attacks them out of the blue, even though God, and again, it's very ironic because at the beginning of Parshat Bishalach, the beginning of the portion of Bishalach, where this chapter is the last chapter of that portion, the Torah said that God did not want to take them via the quick route, lest they see war and return to Egypt. So part of the goal was to give them time to, so to speak, grow, adjust, mature, so that they didn't see war and freak out. And yet the parsha ends with a war with Amalek, which of course is very ironic. And of course, the Jewish people are successful. And at the end of that, the Bible has a very interesting statement. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Ketov zot zikaron b'sefer, v'sim be'oznei Yehusha, ki macho emchet zecher Amalek mitachat hashamayim. I will utterly destroy any memory, any remnant of Amalek from under the heavens. Vayivim Moshe vayikra shmo Hashem nisiyam ki yara kesiyam milchama Hashem v'Amalek midor dor. So if I only had the passage in Exodus here, it seems that it's a kind of metaphysical battle between God and Amalek. It doesn't explicitly call on the human being to do anything. It's a purely God function. The only thing that you're supposed to do as a human being is to write this down. Moshe is told to write it down in a book. That God, Macho Emched Zecher Amalek, that I will destroy Amalek. And the fact that the text says that this is something that, so to speak, God is going to do, in fact, leads some halachists later on in history to claim that, we have the famous passage, the famous mitzvah before Purim of Parshat Zachor, the mitzvah that we're supposed to remember what Amalek did to us, and the commandment to destroy Amalek. And there are some who say that if you just read this passage, you don't fulfill your mitzvah, because this mitzvah is totally on the metaphysical plane of God doing and destroying Amalek. There's nothing for the human being, to do. Where it does get explicit is in chapter 25 in the book of Deuteronomy. There, which according to, that's where we read the Zachor, remember what Amalek did to you. And there it's very much on the human level. The human being is called upon to respond. Zachor et asher asah lecha Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you. Baderech, b'tzeitchem mitzrayim. Asher karcha baderech. They attacked you on the way. Vayzanei b'cha kol hanachashim acharecha. And they attacked all of the weak. V'ata yefi yagev l'erolim. You were very tired. When God gets you settled in the land, you should eradicate the Zecher Amalek. You should eradicate the remnant and the remembrance of Amalek. Again, the simple reading is you are supposed to destroy Amalek. Now, how far does that go? Again, the Bible is very ambiguous. It just says, you shall destroy Amalek. Notice that in the passage in Deuteronomy, again, there is no explicit mention of what exactly that entails. Men, women, children. There is no mention of, is this outside of the laws of regular war of the biblical canon, right? We know that the Bible has very kind of strict guidelines about battle, that you first have to offer peace, and if they don't offer peace, then you can go to war, etc., etc. And so it's a little bit unclear. Once again, if I had just this passage, it tells me that there's an obligation to destroy Amalek. Again, how far-reaching is that? Unclear. It could be just, again, in the context of normal war. The Bible also here, for the first time, also gives us a sense of why it is that Amalek is so terrible. It sounds like part of them is because they did not act in an honorable way in war, that they attacked, that they were terrorists, if we want to use our modern terminology. They attacked the women, the children, all the weak people, and you were tired. And there was no real reason for this attack. It's not a territorial gain. Amalek were nomads, etc., etc. So that's the way the Bible presents it, and we don't see explicitly how far we're supposed to be. Again, it could be war. Now, in the ancient world, war was very brutal. War was very total. The concern for collateral damage, which is a very modern conception, certainly didn't exist in the ancient world. Didn't exist, 100 years ago either. So that's certainly. So if I just emerge from the first two sources in the Torah, so Amalek is a mitzvah. To destroy Amalek is a mitzvah, but it doesn't necessarily, undermine or go beyond, the normal wars that the Jewish people are commanded. In fact, maybe it's under the realm of the command, maybe it's not, but that is certainly up in the air. What really is, so to speak, the key text, which raises all of the issues and all of the theological issues and all of the moral issues, is actually the passage in the book of Samuel. In the book of Samuel, and one other thing that I want to, before we go to the book of Samuel, the Bible also doesn't specify, is this a personal obligation or is it only a national obligation? When it talks about that you are supposed to destroy Amalek, does that mean that if I have a nice Amalekite neighbor, down the street with a white picket fence and a dog and two cars, that I have to destroy him if I can ascertain that he's really an Amalekite? Or is this, is this purely a communal mitzvah, a national mitzvah, that you have an obligation to go to war against the Amalekites, and it'll be a very intense war, a total war, but it's not necessarily a personal obligation that you and I have to kill every Amalekite that comes our path, but only in the context of war. And in war, and certainly in the ancient world, if you wanted to be able to survive, as Rav Kook writes in a very famous letter, that if the Jewish people had, so to speak, emerged in the ancient world and all of a sudden preached pacifism, and they would turn the other cheek and never respond, and they would have been eaten up alive in the ancient world, in which you needed to be able to survive. You need to have an army, you need to have a government, you need to defend yourself, and you need to be able to aggressively counter enemies, and have that tough mentality. So if we leave the first two sources, I don't think particularly they necessarily raise all the moral qualms. What really raises the moral qualms is when we go to the subsequent sources, and specifically the book of Shemuel, the book of Samuel. And Samuel, of course, is told by Shaul, the first king of Israel, is told by Samuel that part of his responsibility is to go now and destroy Amalek. In verse 2, that attacked it on the way. So you should go and attack Amalek, and you shall confiscate all that they own and make it haram, make it hacharem, make it cherem, make it outside the bounds of enjoying it. V'lo tachmol alav, show no mercy. Ve'imata me'ish ad isha, you have to attack and kill men, from every man, every woman, me'olel ad yonek, from every child, mishor v'ad zeh migamal. It's a total destruction of Amalek. Now, once again here, on a pshat level, on a plain sense level, what exactly is going on? On the one hand, there is no context here in which this is a personal obligation. This is an obligation on the nation, on the king. Saul is the king, and it's an obligation on the king to go and lead the people in battle. On the other hand, there is no, like you find in many other passages in the Bible, where the Bible says you're supposed to offer them a way out. You're supposed to offer them surrender, be under the subjugation of the Israelite nation, state, etc., monarchy. There is no offer of peace here. God explicitly says to Shaul, go and kill out the Amalekites. Number one. Number two, it's also interesting. Here is where the Bible explicitly comes the closest to what we might call genocide, in saying that they're supposed to destroy every man, woman, and child. Now, again, how do you understand that? Do you understand it as they're supposed to go up to every single man, woman, and child and kill them? Or does it mean that God is saying go and fight total war without any consideration at all of what we would call collateral damage, as opposed to in other wars where you're supposed to, offer peace and offer a way out and offer this and offer that and only kill the men and not kill the women? Here, it's a total battle where you're not supposed to care at all Is that what is saying, or is it that there's a personal obligation that every Amalekite that you meet, you have to go and kill, whether they are fighting a battle, whether they're combatants or the non-combatants? The third question is also, and again, on a pshat level, and just sticking on the pshat level, on the plain sense, what exactly was he being commanded here? Was he being commanded to kill out all of the Amalekites throughout the world? Or was he being commanded to eradicate the Amalekites in this specific area that were posing a threat to the establishment and the ability of King Saul and the Israelite nation to fully take root and conquest of the land? The reason why I raise that is because later on in the book of Shmuel, towards the end of the book of Shmuel, the Bible tells us a story about the fact that the Amalekites attack David's property, caravans, tents, etc. And it seems like there's a lot of Amalekites running around, and it's kind of weird, because the Bible seems to present the story as if Saul killed out all the Amalekites except Agag, Melech, the king, before Samuel came and killed him. But later on, we see a lot of Amalekites running around. So again, does that speak to the fact that in the understanding on the pshat level, there was never any obligation to kill every single Amalekite that you met, but in the context of war, you weren't necessarily going to take any precautions to save any of them? So again, that's one issue. Number two, does it mean that this specific area of Amalekites was supposed to be cleaned out, but not necessarily much beyond that? So when we leave the actual biblical texts, we are left with a lot of ambiguities. Yeah, on the one hand, it's very harsh, but on the other hand, number one, is it something that only God is really supposed to do? Number two, the passage in Devarim, which does involve human beings, is it only a national obligation? It's not necessarily a personal obligation, which again mitigates somewhat some of the moral issues. Number three, again, what does it mean to limchot et zecher Amalek, to destroy and wipe away? And again, we use very florid language, but it may simply mean that you fight total battle and total war without offering the normal offers of peace, etc. Number three, when we get to the book of Shmuel, the book of Shmuel is the most explicit that you have to destroy every Amalekite. Now, again, is it just in that area? Is it something that is, so to speak, beyond this area? Is it a personal obligation? Is it all the same questions emerge? My point being that if one looks at the Torah Shebichtav, one looks at the biblical texts, one doesn't necessarily get the sense, or one doesn't necessarily can't conclude that we have a personal obligation in every generation that every single Amalekite should be killed, by every individual Jew. On the other hand, when we get to the Middle Ages, and let's go to source 4, we find the following. We find a great dispute between the Rishonim, between the Sefer HaChinuch and the Rambam, between the Sefer HaChinuch, who we're not sure who wrote it in the Middle Ages, and Maimonides, about the scope of this mitzvah. On the one hand, if you take a look, let's look at source 5 first. If you look at Maimonides, Maimonides says in Sefer HaMitzvot, bilvad mishar zera Esav zecharim v'nekevot ktanim gdulim. We have an obligation to destroy Amalek, all of Amalek, men, women, and children. So the Rambam integrates what appears explicit in the book of Shmuel as part of the mitzvah, as part of the commandment forever and ever. And that's what it says, Timchet Zecher Amalek, that you have an obligation to destroy Amalek. And he says, very interestingly, again, notice, let's listen to the language. Ukvar kadam lanu shalosh mitzvot, and we already have this tradition of the rabbis. The Jewish people were commanded in 3 cardinal mitzvot when they entered the land of Israel. Limnot lahem melech, to establish a king, a political government. Livnot beit habchira, to build the Beit Hamikdash. Ulimchot zer Amalek. Umilchama zohi milchemet mitzvah. This war is milchemet mitzvah. Notice for the Rambam, the destruction of Amalek is all in the context of war. It's a milchama. It's not stam. You and I have a personal obligation to go and kill every Amalekite baby that we come across. It is specifically a national mitzvah. And that's why for the Rambam, it's very important that it's part of this triad of mitzvot. There's a mitzvah to appoint a king. There's a mitzvah to establish the Beit HaMikdash and build the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. And finally, there's a mitzvah to destroy Amalek, which is, again, all part of this national dimension of establishing Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. But again, it's in the context of war. Umilchama zohi milchemet mitzvah. And the Rambam continues in the next mitzvah, in the Sefer HaMitzvot, he should liskor masha salur Amalek bakdimo leheral. And we're supposed to remember, in addition to destroying Amalek, we're supposed to remember what Amalek did to us. So you're supposed to remember what Amalek did to attack us, and to hate Amalek, and we should, through our words, inspire people to fight, and we should encourage the people to hate Amalek and what it stands for. And it shouldn't go down. Again, so for the Rambam, this is a national mitzvah that applies, that we are supposed to go and fight. Lehilachembo, milchama. On the other hand, if you look at in source number 4, you see a different strand, albeit a minority strand, but one that certainly in the consciousness of many Jews has become the dominant ethos when it comes to Amalek. So, Sefer Chinuch writes, we're commanded to destroy Amalek, the descendants of Amalek, anybody who comes from the nation of Amalek. Gadol v'katan, men, women, children, adults, young people. And then he says, V'zota mitzvah mutelat al tzibur kulan. This mitzvah, first of all, is on the tzibur, on the community. Uchinyan shamru zichronam shalosh mitzvot nitzavu Yisrael. There are 3 mitzvot that the Jewish people were commanded when they entered the land of Israel. We mentioned before, to establish a king, a government, livnot lahem beit bechira, to build a temple, a center of religious worship, ulachrit zer Amalek, to destroy Amalek. But then he adds, ube'emet, ki gam al kol yachid miYisrael ascharim mutal hachiyuv lehargam labdam min haolam. He says this is not only an obligation on the tzibur, it's an obligation not only on the community, it's an obligation on each individual. If you find an Amalekite, to kill him. This is the most far-reaching formulation in the tradition, that this is not just something which is given over to the government to do and to use its discretion when, where, how, but it's a personal obligation on each yachid, each individual Jew, which of course raises the stakes and brings us back to the question: are we personally supposed to be involved in killing even people who are, 10 generations later, who happen to be from the nation of Amalek, but never necessarily did any harm to us directly? So how much guilt, how much obligation? Again, the Sefer Chinuch is the most stark formulation and raises the question. Now let's turn to the second sheet, because the second sheet now, like I said, will, again, start to address, again, I want to show you how the Rishonim, certainly in the medieval period, started to try to finesse some of this, driven by, I think, moral concerns about the scope. If you take the Sefer Chinuch's notion, it raised lots of problems morally and ethically, and internal to the biblical values. For example, the idea that you're supposed to destroy Amalek forever and ever, and even more that it's a personal obligation, flies in the face of the idea, for example, later on in the Bible, of lo yimtu avot al banim ubanim lo yimtu al avotam. The children should not die for the sins of the fathers. There's a kind of vicarious punishment, which is very problematic. What does some Amalekite baby, who lives 300 years later, why are they responsible? They haven't done anything personally. So the collective guilt, the collective punishment, all that raises questions about the justice, God's justice, about the world, about all these things are up in the air. So as I said, one approach that again begins to minimize this is to again focus on the fact that it is a national mitzvah and not a personal mitzvah. So we take away some of that. So we saw in the Rambam explicitly said that it is a national obligation. It's not a personal obligation. This is also found in other Rishonim. The Sefer HaYireim, Rabbi Lezer Mimetz from Metz in Germany writes, there's an obligation to destroy Amalek. He quotes the Psukim, and he writes, Lamadnu, towards the end of this, the part that I underline, Lamadnu mikan shemitzvah limchot zecher Amalek al hamelech mutelet v'lo al shar Yisrael. So he goes even further. He says it's only an obligation on the king. It's not an obligation on the rest of Israel. It sounds like even the rest of Israel, when it's organized in a national level, it's purely an obligation of the king and only the king. So that's, so to speak, one approach. The more that you minimize who exactly is entitled, who has the right to go and touch Amalek, you're in a different planet. Number two, if we go back to that passage, I'm not going to go back, physically, but if you go back to the passage in Shmuel, it's very interesting why God has to explicitly appear to Shaul, and tell him he's got to go and kill Amalek to that extent. Isn't it already a mitzvah in the Torah? It's a mitzvah in the Torah. Saul knew the mitzvah as well as we did. And so one approach that you find in some of the commentaries is, but again, as I showed you before, there's a certain ambiguity in the text when it says go and destroy Amalek. What does that mean? Does it mean to fight a war? Does it mean to offer peace before you go to war? Does it mean that you wage a total war, including destroying all the civilians, etc., etc.? And so it's only in the book of Samuel where you have an explicit command by God that this is what God means in terms of adjudicating and fulfilling the mitzvah of destroying Amalek. And if that's true, so you'll find some achronim, some later commentaries who will say, what you see from here is that whatever it says in the Torah, to actually put into practice the most extreme formulation, a la the Sefer HaChinuch or others, you need an explicit divine commandment, an explicit divine revelation, and direction at the moment that this is going to happen. So again, you limit. It's not, every person can do it for himself. First of all, you reject the idea that it's a personal obligation. It's only a national obligation. Number two, it's not that, every summer you decide you're going to do this. No, you have to wait for a specific divine command in order to, so to speak, effectuate and put into practice what God has commanded in the Bible in terms of what exactly is the scope, the range of this obligation. Number three, if you look at source number 7, the very famous, there's the Mishnayot write in Yadayim. The Mishnah Yadayim writes as follows: Bo Bayom, on the day when Rabbi Gamliel was deposed from being the Nasi in the Beit HaMidrash, because he had acted heavy-handedly towards Rabbi Yehoshua. So on that day, the Gemara tells us, Ba Yehuda Ger Amoni v'amad lifnei Beit HaMidrash Amar lehem mani avo lakahal. So Ger from the community of the nation of Ammon came and said, am I allowed to enter and marry into the Jewish people? Amrulo Rabbi Gamliel, asurata, forbidden, because it says in the Torah. Amar la Rishua mutarata. Amar la Gamliel, oh, it says, lo yavo amoni v'amoni b'ha'al Hashem gam dor asiri. It says that an Ammoni and a Moavia, an Ammonite and a Moabite is not allowed to enter into the Jewish community for 10 generations. Do you think that the Ammonites and the Moabites that we encounter today, they're still in the same place that they were 100 years ago or 200 years ago, 300 years ago? They're not the same. This is a different people. Kvar Allah Sancheiriv, just like Egypt is not actually full of ancient Egyptians. So he says, Kvar Allah Sancheiriv Melech Ashur ubilbel et kol ha'umot. So this is a famous rabbinic trope that at the point in the 730s and 720s BCE, Sancheiriv in rabbinic language and the biblical language came, and because the Assyrians were very into population transfer, what we would call today ethnic cleansing, and moving populations from place to place. But so he says, Kfar Allah Sancheiriv Melech Ashur ubilbel et kol ha'umot. All of the various nations have been all kind of mixed up. And so today we don't really know who Amalek is. So it's a kind of it's a safe fail measure in the sense that, yes, maybe there was at one time in history, there was an obligation to destroy Amalek. And maybe it included, if you go down the road of the Sefer Chinuch, it included a personal obligation to destroy him. But it's an inoperable mitzvah because we don't really know who Amalek is. And so to speak, again, you could say it in more, not mystical terms, but in more kind of philosophical terms, you would say that the divine providence, hashgacha pratit, brought it about in such a way that this mitzvah would never be operable. Because it's such a horrifying, difficult mitzvah to put into practice, God created the scenarios that it would end up that we never would have to put it into practice. And so that's kind of a third tactic of Ba'al Sancheiriv, which basically neutralizes the ethical confrontation, because we're never going to have that confrontation anymore, because we never know. This person who thinks he's Amalekite, maybe he's really Mexican or whatever it is. He's not necessarily from Amalek. That's, so to speak, a third approach. So number one is minimizing it from the personal to the national, and it's only in the context of war. Number two, to suggest that, again, you would need a specific commandment from a prophet like Shmuel to interpret and know exactly what God wants in this specific case or in that specific case. And so unless you have a direct communication from a Navi, you can never implement it because of all the ambiguities. And number three is this approach of Bilbel Ha'umot, that since Sancheiriv messed up the gene pool and messed up all the various and ethnic cleansing, so we don't really know who Amalek is anymore. And again, you can add to that a kind of religious hashgacha pratit, the kind of divine providence approach, and says that God wanted this mitzvah, so to speak, to become inoperable. And so Sancheiriv, so to speak, does the trick where he mixes up all the nations and we don't really know who is who. A fourth approach is the approach of Maimonides with the interpretation of later commentaries. If you look in the Rambam, let's move it up a little bit to source number 8. So if we go to source number 8, Maimonides writes, and you have the English with you here as well, V'imlo hishlimu. Maimonides in the Laws of War, Kings and Wars, describes exactly what you're supposed to do when you go to war. And Maimonides says that you always have to ask for peace. You always have to sue for peace, for surrender before you go to war. And if they say no, that's when you apply the laws of war. So Maimonides makes a very striking statement in describing the war. He says, "V'im lo hishlimu." If they do not, well, actually, I should have printed a little earlier passage in my mind. Maimonides starts the chapter whatever it is, 6. He says, Ein holchim lemilchama im adam, ella im kain korin l'shalom. You never go to war except, first of all, by asking and suing for surrender and peace so that you can avoid the war. That is an explicit statement of Maimonides. And he says, Ein osim milchama im shum adam, with any person in the world. It sounds like that includes Amalek, that you have the option, paradoxically, strangely, of if they choose not to battle with you, so then there's no more milchama neged Amalek. There's no more obligation to fight. Since it's a national dimension, and it's only in the context of fighting the war. If they don't want to fight a war, they're willing to surrender, willing to compromise, whatever it is, then you don't have an obligation. Maimonides seems to say this later as well, where he writes, if they didn't agree to the terms of making peace, or if they did, but they did not accept upon themselves the Noahide laws, the basic code of mankind. You go and fight them, and you kill all the adult males, etc., etc. But then the Rambam writes, this is all in relationship to the 7 nations. Not to the 7 nations that inhabit the land of Israel. But when it comes to the 7 nations, Aval Shivat Amamin va'Amalek Shelo Yishlimu Ein Menichim Bahem Neshama. So when it comes to all the other nations, if they don't want to make peace, then you go to a battle and you destroy and kill and maim all of the males, but not the females. But when it comes to, says Rambam in the 3rd line of Al Shiva Amamim va'Amalek Shelo Yishlimu. If you are dealing with the conquest of the land of Israel, the 7 nations that live in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Canaan, va'Amalek, or in a scenario with Amalek, Shelo Yishlimu, who did not agree to your terms, Ein Menichin Mehem Neshama, then you kill everybody else out. You simply kill everybody out, as it says, Lo T'chayek Kol Neshama. Notice Maimonides makes the striking statement that suing for peace applies to Amalek as well. Very different than what we would have thought. We would have thought there's a total obligation to eradicate Amalek. What is this business of, you offer them a chance to make peace and live in harmony with the rest of the community? What does that mean? And he includes Amalek. Amalek and the 7 nations that chose not to make peace, then you don't leave them alive. Implication being that if they do make peace, you do leave them alive. Let's continue to the next page, please. So, and Maimonides seems also to imply, again, very radical, but again, there's a lot of Talmudic evidence for this. Maimonides writes, Kol hagoyim kulam, all the nations of the world. He doesn't make any exceptions. Kashid gairuvi kablu alehem kol mitzvah shel Torah. When they accept all the mitzvot, harein ke Yisrael l'chol davar, they're like Jews. Shenemar v'hakel chuka achat lachem. Everyone has the same law. Excuse me. Umutarim likanes v'kal Hashem miyad, and they're allowed to enter. You have to marry a Jew, etc., etc. So Maimonides says explicitly that everybody can become a ger. Everybody can become a convert. The implication is very clear, including Amalekites, that you can have Amalekite converts. Now, how can you have Amalekite converts if they're dead? Because the minute you meet up with the Amalekite, you got to kill them. So clearly, Maimonides doesn't believe that you have an obligation to kill him on the spot, because there is no personal obligation. It's a national obligation. Number 2, in this context, Maimonides seems to, as I said, accept the notion of Gerim, and there seems to be no distinction between Amalek and anybody else. Again, wild, radical, but again, it shows you that, again, for Maimonides, the confrontation with Amalek is not on a personal level, but it's on a national level. And if this person doesn't want to be part of Amalek, they can leave the fold of Amalek because they're not acting like Amalek anymore, which leads to the amazing tshuva, source number 10, a more contemporary source of the Avnei Nezer. Avnei Nezer was very famously he's known as the Sachachava Rav. He's known as the rabbi. He was a student of the Ger Rebbe. He's again a very great Talmid Chacham and also a great Hasidic master. So he chews over the Maimonidean statements that you can sue for peace even with Amalek, that you can have a ger from Amalek. In fact, the rabbis, in a very famous statement, write, Mibnei banav shel Haman, the great grandchildren of Haman are studying Torah in Bnei Brak. They converted and joined the Jewish people. It's an amazing statement, and this is probably where Maimonides got this. The Avnei Nezer wants to put some theological meat on these bones, and so he writes in a very famous tshuva. He says, "Aval zera Amalek shenenashim ba'avon avotam." He raises the theological problem. What does it mean that 1,000 years later you can hold responsible the Amalekites for what their great grandparents did? We don't believe in vicarious punishment in the Bible. The Bible says explicitly in other parts of the Bible, in the book of Yechezkel, says explicitly, Ish bechet o yumat, every person dies on his own sin. There's no such thing as a transfer of sin. So he writes, Ulechora haktiv lo yimtu avot al banim banim lo yimtu avotam. It says that children, fathers shouldn't die for children. Children should. Now you could say that verse is only talking about in the context of a judicial process. In the judiciary, when you bring someone to court, you can't be tried for your children can't be tried for you. But he doesn't go that direction. He assumes that is also the way the world is supposed to work. The world of Torah and mitzvot is supposed to work. Lo yumtu avot al banim. Fathers shouldn't die for the sins of the children. Children shouldn't die for the sins of the fathers. But, he says, why is it that, in effect, we do seem to apply that to Amalek? He writes, Ach galui v'yadu lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu shesinatam tmuna b'libam. But rather it was clear to God that they had this long suffering prejudice of hate to the Jewish people. Pok chazeh, look, Maaseh Haman Hagagi, look at the descendants of Amalek who happened to be Haman. What the Avnei Nezer did in that line was amazing. It says in the Aseret HaDibrot, in the 10 Commandments, which are addressed to the Jewish people, it says that God holds Poked Avon Avot Al Banim, God holds responsible for many, many generations the sins of the fathers on the children, which of course once again raised the theological problem in the eyes of the rabbis. How is it that children can be held responsible for the sins of the father? Don't we believe Ish bechet o yumat? Every person has to be judged on their own for their sins and merits. So the rabbis came up with an ingenious solution. When do they get punished in addition to their sins for the sins of their fathers? That's the famous rabbinic phrase. When they hold on and continue to do what the fathers did. Because in that situation, they're showing that they are simply in the same boat as the parents and want to continue. In that situation, but if the children did teshuvah, the kiblu Sheva mitzvot, and they accepted the 7 commandments. Then the Amalekites are no longer following in the ways of their forefathers. Now, what the Avnei Nezer has done here is ingenious. He's taken a halachic concept of ochazin maaseh avotem, which is used in the context of Jews, context of Israelites. How can they be held responsible for their parents? And he turns that into a broad principle that applies to non-Jews as well. That if there are people in Amalek who choose not to act in Amalekite ways, they're no longer Amalek. Amalek is not a genetic, inherent, metaphysical, ontological, whatever fancy word you want to use, reality that inheres in every single Amalekite DNA. It is a behavior. And if you're no longer acting in an Amalekite way, you're not Amalek. They're no longer punished. Again, etc., etc. He says, in general, Amalek showed the quality that they didn't want to respect the Jewish people in any way and didn't want to be subservient. The rabbis have a famous mashal, the famous image, the famous metaphor, that part of the sin of Amalek is the fact that they kind of took away the sheen of the Jewish people, having left Egypt and crossing the Red Sea and all the Makot and everything, all the things, by attacking the Jewish people and roughing them up, so to speak. They, so to speak, broke some of the fear, some of the deterrence that the other nations had. The rabbis used the famous mashal of, if you have a very, very hot tub of water, the first person who jumps in may be scalded and may end up being hurt by it. But in the end, he cools down the water with his own body temperature and allows others to. Okay. So that's what Amalek represents. Va'al okay, whatchamacall. And that's why that's why we don't necessarily know what's their intention. So, but he writes at the end in the underlined passage, Ach b'shat kibush she'az tzarich lekabel misim v'shibud shu nivzim v'shvelim le'erim rosh b'Yisrael v'gam shibud hinei shemitratzel yot nichnaz eino oches masi yadav ein mechuyav mita. He says the Avnei Nezer, Rav Sachachav writes that if, however, he's willing to accept being part of the subjugated minority of the non-Jews who helped work on behalf of Klal Yisrael and the Beit HaMikdash and other places, then just add so that we don't lose my power. So then they're no longer acting in a Amalekite way, and therefore they're not treated like Amalekites. This is a radical rereading of the Amalekite status in the Halakha. Now, the final approach I would mention in this context goes back to something that we spoke about last week. I didn't have it in front of me when I was putting together the source sheet, and it's not online, so I would just mention it outside in passing. Rabbi Lamb, in a very famous book, which is a collection of essays on war and peace in the Jewish tradition, which is obviously very appropriate at this time in Jewish history and what's going on in Israel. So Rabbi Lamb, alav hashalom, has a very, very powerful article where he addresses some of the moral dilemmas relating to the war against the 7 nations, and specifically the war against Amalek, and the challenges of treating it from a moral point of view. And Rabbi Lamb develops something, again, as we said last time or 2 times ago, the idea of halakha as a floor and not a ceiling. And while Halakha allowed us, in a certain sense, and that's the way he reads it, told us that in certain generations we had an obligation to destroy Amalek because otherwise we wouldn't be able to function in society. We no longer necessarily aspire to that, and that we aspire to a higher level of morality that's implicit in the Torah. In a sense, he writes that he uses the terminology of a developing morality. And he writes, I'm reading a couple of passages out loud. However, the concept of developing morality can prove acceptable and helpful. It is based upon Torah laws and Torah morality. The moral reasoning for which we attempt to circumvent a biblical mandate must itself issue from or be compatible with Torah and mitzvot, a reasoning based upon a profound belief that the Torah is the source and confirmation of moral excellence. So he basically, again, just like we saw a few weeks ago, and he cites Rabbi Rabinovich, Zichron Livracha, about slavery, that slavery was a permitted act, but that's not the ultimate goal of the Torah because it flies in the face, of another kind of meta halachic principle, which is the principle of avadai hein v'lo avadim la'avadim. You should ultimately be servants of God and not servants to anybody else, any human being. It goes against the notion of God created every human being in the image of God. And so you have these kind of principles, meta principles, coming to conflict with certain details of halakha, because halakha allows for certain things in certain societies. And this is the same thing. By the same token, he writes, the idea of refraining from harming civilian non-combatants reflects the Torah value of thou shalt not kill, and the father shall not be put to death for the sins of the children. Likewise, the reluctance to implement, even theoretically, the Torah's stern commandments concerning Amalek and the 7 nations bespeaks a later development that always inhered latently in Torah itself. This may be looked upon as a non-technical kind of lifnim mishurat adin, which supererogatory nature is part of Torah itself. And so, in this reading, our moral intuitions, which are ultimately rooted in primary and central halachic and Jewish concepts, like Tzelem Elokim, every human being is created in the image of God. You shouldn't murder, lo tirtzach, all those things will therefore find expression in the fact that the Torah, while it mandated killing Amalek in the past, would today, so to speak, doesn't mandate that for all these reasons. And, you could go to the fact that Sancheriv messed up all the nations is a kind of divine sign that this is no longer an applicable law that we should be using, because ultimately we want to get to the ideal. And yes, in the ancient world, if Am Yisrael was going to be able to survive, they needed to be very harsh with their enemies, and especially an enemy like Amalek. But ultimately, the goal is to get to a place where we're not doing that. Okay, and this is where Rabbi Lamb is going with it, in the sense, this idea, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And so this is the Rabbi Lamb's approach in this context. So tonight we saw a number of approaches in terms of how we dealt with and how over over history, in a certain sense, we didn't get rid of the psukim in the Torah, because that's not the way that traditional Jews deal with problematic texts. But in certain ways, we neutralized them. And there's a strand. Again, it's not the only strand. It's not all the strands. But again, I wanted to show you different strands that try to navigate between the halakha and ethics when it comes to Amalek and what it was trying to and the idea. And again, we saw different strands that tried to minimize the conflict. Number one, it's only a national mitzvah, it's not an individual mitzvah. That's the view of most Rishonim. Even the biblical text may be ambiguous. How far do you go? Does it mean really total war where you kill every single male, that you meet, woman and child that you meet on the street, even in war? Or is it only that in the context of war, you don't worry about what we would call collateral damage? We saw the approach that said, yes, even in war, you have to wait for an explicit commandment from a Navi, even though the Bible says to go and destroy Amalek, but even then, you need a specific commandment from the Navi to say how far you can go in applying this law, which again limits the application of this law. We saw the concept of Ba Sancheru Bilbel et Ha'umot. Sancheru came and messed up with all of his population transfers and ethnic cleansing. We don't know really who's who anymore, and so it becomes an inoperative law. We then saw the Rambam, and the Rambam explicitly says that you can even make peace with Amalek because they're no longer acting in an Amalekite fashion. We can accept Gerim from Amalek once again because they're not acting in Amalekite fashion, made explicit by the Avnei Nezer, the Avram of Sachachav, who says that, if they're not acting like Amalek, then we don't treat them like Amalek. It's not a genetic, inherent, metaphysical statement, which has far-reaching implications. And finally, the Rabbi Lamb approach that we live in a kind of developing morality where the Bible wants us to get to a certain place. It allowed for certain things in certain history and mandated certain things, but the fact is that the goal is to get to the place where we're not really putting such a thing into practice, because our ultimate values, the meta values of Tzelem Elokim, Lo Tirtzach, all the don't murder, all those things are ultimately where we're going. So this was a case study in how, in effect, the Amalekite dilemma was kind of neutralized ultimately throughout history and certainly till today. Okay, with that, we close our class for this week. Next week, as I said, will be our final class before Hanukkah. So we'll see each other again. I don't foresee any problems. It'll be the night of it's December 4th.
Yes, December 4th. So 1 week from today.
1 week from now will be the last class, and then we'll see where we. Again, I'm not sure exactly what we're going to cover, but hopefully during the course of the week, after I get some more sleep, I just got back from Israel this morning, I'll figure it out a little bit more intensely. I wish everybody a wonderful week and a good Shabbat, and let's hope that all the hostages get home, as many as possible, as quickly as possible, back to their families. Everybody, men, women, and children, be back together with their families. Okay. Good evening, and have a great week, everybody.
Amen. Thank you so much, Rav Helfgot, and thank you everyone here for being part of our learning community. I just want to quickly let you guys know some more things going on at Drisha. We have 2 new classes starting this week. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. with Rabbinic Leah Sana, we have Hanukkah Holiday of Homebodies. And then on Wednesday, we have starting Technologies of Transmission at 8 p.m. with Rabbinite Sarah Wolkenfeld. We have the registration open for our Winter's Man starting on the 25th to 27th of December with a special short program on organ donation, and we'll be continuing with our Mishnah in-depth program with Ketubot with Rabbi Leah Sana. You can find all of those at the link I just sent to the chat, 5784.drisha.org/winter. So if you want to start planning your winter learning, now's the time. See you next week. Thank you.